This story is titled, I Always Thought We Were Just Friends, until his fiancée forced him to choose. But when everything fell apart, I realized we were closer than I ever knew. You never think betrayal will happen to you until it does. For years, I believed in the life I had built, the relationships I nurtured, the people I loved. But trust is a fragile thing. You don't realize how easily it can be shattered until you're staring at the pieces, wondering how the hell you got here. It all started with Troy. He wasn't just my best friend. He was my brother in everything but blood. We met in 8th grade, bonded over bad cafeteria food and our shared love of classic rock. By high school, our trio was complete when we met Adam. The three of us became inseparable, the kind of friendship people envy. We weren't just close, we relied on each other. Life wasn't always kind to us. We had our fair share of family troubles, but that only made our bond stronger. I remember the summer before college when both Troy and Adam stayed at my house for a couple of months. Home wasn't exactly a safe place for them, so my folks took them in without hesitation. We weren't just friends at that point, we were family. Even after we went off to different colleges, the distance didn't break us. Every other day, without fail, we'd FaceTime, talking for hours like nothing had changed. We were surviving the transition, trying to hold on to the only constant we'd ever known, each other. Then sophomore year rolled around, and that's when Troy met Emily. I remember when he first mentioned her. He had that stupid, love-drunk grin on his face, the kind that made it obvious he was smitten. Adam and I were happy for him. We knew that Troy deserved something good, someone who made him feel the way Emily apparently did. At first, everything seemed fine. Emily was nice enough when we met her. A little reserved, sure, but polite. I never sensed any hostility from her, not back then. Troy had been up front with her from the start. Adam and I were his people, and that wasn't changing. And she seemed to accept that. But things shifted over time. I started noticing how Emily reacted whenever Troy spent time with us. The way she'd quietly withdraw when we'd visit. How she'd barely engage in conversation. At first, I chalked it up to her being shy or maybe just not used to how intense our friendship was. But then I saw it. The bitterness in her eyes when Troy would laugh a little too hard at one of Adam's jokes. The stiffness in her posture when he'd lean against me on the couch. The way her jaw tightened whenever he said, "I love you" to us in passing. I ignored it. That was my first mistake. Over the years, Troy and Emily's relationship grew more serious, and so did the distance she put between him and us. It wasn't something sudden, more like a slow, creeping shift that we didn't notice until it was too late. Whenever we visited, Troy would spend more time with us than with her. He'd brush off our concerns, saying, "She sees me every day. You guys? Maybe once every 6 months." We let it go because we didn't want to rock the boat. But in hindsight, that was the beginning of the end. Then Adam was gone. His suicide blindsided us. There were no warning signs, no cries for help that we could see. One day he was there, and the next, he wasn't. The grief was suffocating. It wrapped itself around my chest and refused to let go. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I felt like I was drowning, and the only person who could keep me afloat was Troy. I lived alone, and after Adam's funeral, I told Troy how unbearable the loneliness had become. Without hesitation, he packed a bag and moved in with me for a few weeks. He never once made me feel like a burden. We stayed up late, talking about Adam, about our memories, about the what-ifs that haunted us. It was the only thing that made the pain bearable. Then Emily called. I remember the way Troy's face darkened as he answered the phone. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand clenched into a fist. And then I did hear her, because she was yelling loud enough that even I could make out the words. "You need to come home. Now." Troy rubbed his temple. "Emily, I told you." "I don't care. You've been there for weeks. Do you think I'm stupid?" "I know what's going on." I sat up, confused. Troy shook his head, his jaw tight. "Nothing's going on. I'm here because I need to be. My best friend just died, Emily. This isn't about you." She laughed bitterly. "Not about me. You're living with her. You spend all your time with her. What am I supposed to think, Troy?" The realization hit me like a truck. She thinks we're... Troy was already saying it. "You think I'm cheating on you? You're choosing her over me. Again, and I'm done with it. Either you come home, or we're done." The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. I held my breath. And then Troy said the words that changed everything. "That's not fair, Emily. If you can't understand that I need her right now, then maybe we're not meant to be together." Emily went quiet. Then in a voice that was eerily calm, she said, "Fine, think about that," and hung up. Troy stared at his phone for a long time. Then he turned to me, his face unreadable. "She's going to need time." I nodded, unsure of what to say. I should have known that wasn't the end of it. In the days that followed that phone call, there was an unspoken weight between us. something neither of us was willing to fully acknowledge, but both of us could feel pressing down on our shoulders. Troy tried to act as though nothing had changed, as if his fiance's ultimatum was just another argument they would eventually move past, something that would smooth over with time, but I knew better. I could see it in the way he would glance at his phone when he thought I wasn't looking, as if expecting a message that never came, or in the way he hesitated before speaking sometimes, choosing his words carefully, almost too carefully, as though he had begun second-guessing what was acceptable to say and what wasn't. I wanted to tell him that Emily's suspicions were ridiculous, that the idea of us being anything other than what we had always been, two people who had survived too much together to ever need words to understand each other, was laughable, but I could sense that saying it out loud wouldn't help. There was something in Troy's expression, in the way his usually confident posture had started to waver just slightly, that made me realize he wasn't just hurt by Emily's accusations. He was confused by them. It was as if he had never even considered the possibility that his relationship with me, with Adam before everything fell apart, had ever been something anyone could misinterpret. I could almost hear Emily's voice in my head, the way she might have framed it when speaking to him, planting doubt where there had been none before. She's always been there, hasn't she? Always in the picture, always the one you turn to first. And now, when you should be grieving with me, you're choosing to grieve with her instead. I wondered how long she had been holding on to those thoughts, how many times she had bitten her tongue over the years, silencing herself in the name of being the understanding girlfriend, only to have it all come spilling out in one desperate moment when she finally couldn't take it anymore. Troy, of course, didn't leave. He stayed in my apartment, moving through the days with a quiet kind of exhaustion, the kind that seeped into his bones and made everything feel heavier than it should. We tried to carry on as we had before, but there was an undeniable shift beneath the surface. Something neither of us wanted to acknowledge, because acknowledging it meant that something had fundamentally changed. Then one evening, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon and cast long, golden streaks across the living room floor, he spoke, his voice low and uncertain in a way I had never heard from him before. I don't know if she's going to forgive me for this. He had been staring at his phone for the past half hour, the screen dark, as though he were willing it to light up with a message that would fix everything. But it never did. I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. Do you want her to? For the first time in weeks, he looked at me like he wasn't sure of the answer. I could see the battle happening inside him, the guilt of having hurt someone he loved, the frustration of not being understood, the exhaustion of trying to navigate emotions that didn't come with a roadmap. I knew he loved Emily. I'd seen it in the way he spoke about her when they first started dating, in the way he would light up when talking about their future, about the life they were building together. But I also knew that love wasn't always enough. Love didn't erase the cracks that had already begun forming long before either of them had noticed, and it certainly didn't erase the fact that, in his most vulnerable moment, she hadn't been the person he had turned to. I don't know, he admitted, running a hand through his hair, his voice barely above a whisper. I just don't know anymore. And that was the moment I knew. This wasn't just about Emily. This wasn't just about grief or misunderstandings or the complicated mess that life had thrown at us. This was about something deeper, something Troy hadn't allowed himself to admit yet. The possibility that maybe, despite everything, despite the years he had spent loving her, despite the future they had planned, he had been clinging to something that wasn't as solid as he had once believed. The next morning, Emily showed up at my apartment. I hadn't been expecting her, and neither had Troy. There was no warning, no text message saying she was on her way, just the sharp, insistent knock at the door that sent a ripple of tension through the room before I even opened it. She looked different from how I had last seen her. There was no anger in her expression, no accusations waiting on the tip of her tongue. Instead, she just looked tired, like she hadn't slept in days, like she had spent too many nights going over every conversation, every interaction, trying to piece together when exactly things had started to go wrong. Troy was standing behind me, his body tense, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, but he didn't say anything. He just waited. Emily exhaled slowly, then met my gaze with an expression I couldn't quite place. I need to talk to Troy, she said finally, and there was something in the way she said it that made it clear. This wasn't going to be a conversation about apologies or forgiveness. This wasn't about fixing things. This was about endings. I stepped aside, giving them space. But as I did, I couldn't help but feel the shift in the air, the way everything seemed to slow down for just a moment. I had spent years watching their relationship from the outside, watching the way they built something together, something that had once seemed unshakable. But now, as I saw them standing face to face, separated by more than just physical distance. I realized the truth. Some things don't break all at once. Some things unravel slowly, piece by piece, until there's nothing left to hold on to. And no matter how much you want to fix it, sometimes you have to accept that letting go is the only way forward. There's something eerie about knowing the moment things fall apart, that one instance when the weight of everything becomes too much, and the fractures that had been forming in the background suddenly splinter into something irreversible. Most of the time, you don't realize it's happening until long after, when you're standing in the wreckage, trying to piece together where it all went wrong. But this was different. I had the misfortune of witnessing it in real time, standing there like an outsider, watching the final unraveling of something that had, at one point, seemed unshakable. I didn't hear every word that passed between them, but I didn't need to. The way they carried themselves, the unspoken tension between them, the way Emily stood with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if physically bracing herself for what she already knew was coming. It said more than words ever could. There was no yelling, no dramatic accusations, just the quiet acceptance of two people who had reached the end of their road and were finally allowing themselves to see it for what it was. When Troy came back inside, he moved slowly, deliberately, like a man who had just put down something unbearably heavy and hadn't quite figured out how to stand without it yet. He didn't look at me right away, just ran a hand through his hair and let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped inside him for years. I wanted to ask if he was okay, but the words felt useless. No one is okay after something like that. Even when you know it's the right thing, even when you know deep down that there was no other way, it still leaves you hollow. We didn't talk about it that night. We barely talked at all. Troy sat on the couch, staring at nothing in particular, and I sat beside him, close enough that he knew I was there, but not close enough to suffocate him with sympathy. There are some kinds of grief that don't need words, that can't be soothed with platitudes. This was one of them. In the days that followed, he didn't bring her up. Not once. And maybe that was what made it real. The absence of her name in our conversations. The way he avoided looking at his phone. As if he had finally resigned himself to the fact that there was no message coming, no last-minute fix, no way to go back to the life he had spent years building. Instead, he threw himself into distraction. He spent more time at work, took on extra shifts, filled every spare moment with something to keep his mind occupied. But I knew better than to think it meant he was fine. I saw the way exhaustion settled into his bones, the way his eyes lingered a little too long on the spaces where her things used to be, the way he would hesitate for just a second before locking the door behind him, as if he were expecting to hear her voice calling him back. And then, one night without warning, he said something that made my breath catch in my throat. I don't know who I am without her. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't self-pitying, it was just honest. And it hit me in a way I hadn't expected, because for the first time, I realized that this wasn't just about a breakup. This was about losing a version of himself that had existed within that relationship, a version of him that had been shaped by years of shared experiences, inside jokes, morning routines, quiet moments that had once seemed insignificant but now felt like ghosts haunting every corner of his life. I wanted to tell him that he was still him, that people don't just disappear when relationships end, that he was more than who he had been with her. But the truth was, I understood what he meant in a way that I didn't want to admit, because when Adam died, I had felt the same way. It was a different kind of loss, but the aftermath was the same. The sense that something fundamental had shifted, that the person you used to be no longer made sense in the absence of the person who had shaped so much of your world. And maybe that was the real reason we had clung to each other so desperately in the months following Adam's death. Maybe it wasn't just grief that had kept us tethered together, but the unspoken fear that without each other, we might lose ourselves completely. But even as I thought it, I realized something else, something that had been creeping at the edges of my mind ever since Emily first made her accusation. If I had been in her place, would I have seen it differently? Would I have questioned why, of all people, Troy had chosen to lean on me instead of the woman he had planned to spend his life with? Would I have resented the way we moved in sync? The way our friendship had blurred the lines between platonic and something harder to define? I didn't want to think about it, because the truth was I had never considered it before. I had never once questioned what Troy meant to me, because I had always believed that friendships could be just as deep, just as meaningful, just as unbreakable as romantic relationships. But now, for the first time, I wondered if I had been naive to think that other people wouldn't see it differently. And maybe, just maybe, that was why Emily had felt so threatened. I didn't tell Troy any of this. He had enough to deal with. But the thought lingered, sitting in the back of my mind like an unanswered question I wasn't ready to face. And then, just when I thought things were finally settling, Just when I thought we had reached some sort of quiet understanding of where we stood in the wreckage of everything that had happened, something else happened. Something I never saw coming. First update. It's strange how life has a way of catching you off guard. How just when you think the dust has finally settled, just when you begin to believe you can start stitching yourself back together, something unexpected comes along and rips open wounds you weren't even aware were still healing. I had assumed that after everything, the loss, the breakups, the distance that had been forced between Troy and Emily, the way we had both been left standing in the aftermath of choices neither of us had ever anticipated making, we would finally be able to move forward, slowly but surely, in whatever form that took. But life rarely follows the path you expect it to, and when the next shift came, I realized that what I had thought was an ending was really just another beginning, one that neither of us had seen coming. It started with something small, something so seemingly insignificant that, at first, I barely registered it as anything worth noticing. Troy, who had spent weeks burying himself in work, who had thrown himself into distractions so aggressively that I had begun to wonder if he would ever slow down, started lingering at my apartment just a little longer than necessary. It wasn't obvious at first, just an extra half hour after dinner, a hesitation before leaving, an excuse to stick around for one more beer, one more conversation, one more episode of whatever show we had absent-mindedly put on in the background as a way to fill the silence. And I didn't think much of it, because why would I? We had always been close, always found comfort in each other's presence, always been the kind of people who didn't need an excuse to exist in the same space without the pressure of conversation or explanation. But then, little by little, other things started happening. The way he looked at me changed, not in a way that I could easily define, not in a way that I even fully understood, but in a way that made me pause, made me wonder if I had been missing something all along. It was in the way his gaze lingered just a second too long when I spoke, as if he was memorizing the way I formed my words, as if he was seeing me for the first time after years of looking straight through me. It was in the way his body angled toward mine in a way that felt different, not in an obvious or intrusive way, but in a way that made the air between us feel heavier, more charged, like something was shifting between us in real time and I was too afraid to acknowledge it. And then there were the moments that I couldn't explain away. The way his hand brushed against mine when he reached for something on the coffee table. The way he laughed at something I said, and then caught himself, as if the sound had surprised him. As if he wasn't expecting to find joy in something so simple. The way he had started checking in more frequently, sending messages throughout the day that weren't just about making plans, but about nothing in particular. About things that didn't matter except for the fact that he wanted to tell me about them. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself that we were both just lost, both just searching for something to anchor us, both just clinging to the only constant we had left after everything else had fallen apart. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more impossible it became to pretend that nothing had changed because it had. And then one night I realized I wasn't the only one who had noticed. It had been a long day, one of those days that dragged on endlessly, where exhaustion settled into my bones in a way that no amount of coffee could fix. Troy had come over after work, the way he often did, and we had fallen into our usual routine, takeout on the couch, a half-hearted attempt at watching something neither of us were actually paying attention to, quiet conversation that ebbed and flowed naturally, as easy as breathing. But then, at some point, he got quiet. Not the kind of quiet that meant he was tired or distracted or lost in thought. It was the kind of quiet that felt intentional, like he was debating whether or not to say something that had been sitting on the edge of his tongue for too long. And when I looked over at him, when I met his gaze, I saw something there that made my stomach twist in a way I didn't fully understand. Because for the first time, I saw the question in his eyes, the unspoken uncertainty, the hesitation of someone who wasn't sure if they were about to cross a line they could never uncross. And suddenly, I felt like I couldn't breathe. Because I knew in that moment that if he said whatever it was that he was thinking, if he gave voice to whatever had been simmering between us, it would change everything. And I wasn't sure if I was ready for that. So I did the only thing I could think to do. I looked away. I changed the subject. I acted like I hadn't noticed the way he was looking at me, like I hadn't felt the weight of the silence stretching between us. I pretended that nothing had changed, even as my heart pounded in my chest, even as my hands felt too warm, even as something deep in my gut told me that I had just sidestepped something that was bound to catch up with me eventually. And maybe that was the biggest lie I told myself, that if I ignored it, if I kept pretending, it would go away. But the thing about unspoken things, about words left unsaid, about feelings pushed aside in the hopes that they will disappear, is that they don't. They linger, they wait, and sooner or later, they demand to be acknowledged. Second update. There's a strange kind of inevitability to certain moments in life, as if they've been quietly making their way toward you all along, no matter how hard you try to outrun them. You tell yourself you're in control, that you can choose which paths to walk, which doors to open, which feelings to acknowledge. But in the end, some things refuse to stay buried. Some truths, no matter how much you try to ignore them, will find their way to the surface. And when they do, there's no going back. For weeks after that night, I told myself I had imagined it, that the shift between us wasn't real, that whatever had flickered in Troy's eyes had been nothing more than exhaustion, or maybe misplaced grief, or maybe just my own mind twisting things into something they weren't. But deep down, I knew better. I knew because I caught myself doing the same thing, hesitating when he spoke, holding my breath when he looked at me a little too long, feeling a strange and unfamiliar tightness in my chest when I heard his name come up in conversations with other people. And then, just like before, life decided that pretending wasn't an option anymore. It happened on a night that should have been just like any other, another evening spent in the quiet familiarity of my apartment, another few hours of easy conversation and unspoken understanding. But from the moment Troy walked through the door, I knew something was different. He looked like someone who had finally made up his mind about something, someone who had spent too long circling the edges of a decision and had finally decided to step over the line. I felt it before he even spoke, before he even sat down, before the air between us shifted into something heavier, something charged with all the words we hadn't said but had been carrying between us for too long. And then, in the simplest, quietest way possible, he acknowledged what we had both been avoiding. He told me that he had spent weeks trying to make sense of everything: his breakup with Emily, Adam's death, the way his life had unraveled into something unrecognizable, the way he had felt lost for so long that he wasn't sure if he would ever find solid ground again. He told me that through all of it, I had been the one constant, the one person who had always been there, the one thing in his life that had never wavered, never let him down, never made him question his place in the world. And then he said the thing I had been too afraid to say myself. He told me that maybe, just maybe, what we had wasn't just friendship. Maybe it had never been. For a long time, I didn't say anything. I just sat there, trying to process the weight of what he had just admitted, trying to piece together the version of my life that had existed before those words and the version that existed after them. Because the truth was, I had never let myself think about it. I had spent so many years convincing myself that what we had was unshakable because it was built on friendship, because it was different, because it didn't need to fit into the boxes that other people tried to put it in. But now, faced with the undeniable reality of what had been lingering between us all along, I realized something that should have been obvious from the very beginning. Emily hadn't been wrong. She had seen something I had refused to acknowledge, something that had been woven into the fabric of my relationship with Troy for years, something that had been waiting for the right moment to make itself known. And now here it was. But knowing the truth and accepting it are two very different things. For a long time, I had built my identity around the idea that love wasn't always romantic, that some connections were stronger than that friendship could be just as deep, just as defining, just as life-altering as any love story. And maybe, in some ways, that was still true. But standing there, looking at Troy, I realized that sometimes the lines between love and friendship weren't as clear-cut as I had always believed. Sometimes they blurred, and sometimes the people you had spent your whole life believing were one thing turned out to be something else entirely. I could have denied it. I could have told him that he was just confused, that he was looking for something to hold on to in the aftermath of everything he had lost. I could have told him that we were better off keeping things as they were, that we had already lost too much, that risking what we had was a mistake. But I didn't, because deep down I knew the truth. I'd known it all along. So instead of pulling away, instead of shutting him out, instead of pretending that nothing had changed, I let myself sit with the weight of it. I let myself acknowledge the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the thing we had been searching for had been right in front of us the whole time. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I stopped running. I stopped pretending. I let myself imagine what it would mean to say yes. And in that moment, I realized something I had never let myself believe before. Some love stories don't begin the way you expect them to. Some love stories don't fit into the narratives we've been told. But that doesn't mean they aren't real. That doesn't mean they aren't worth it. And maybe, just maybe, this was one of them.